this video, we've been concentrating primarily on guitars with a gloss finish, or producing what we call a high gloss finish on guitars through the wet sanding process and then the subsequent buffing process. There's sheens other than gloss which you can consider. Gloss is still pretty much the industry standard for upper end guitars and some of the high end models that might come out of Martin, Gibson, Guild, and some of the other places. And the public really does demand high gloss finishes if they're paying a certain amount for a guitar. However, in the past 5, maybe even 10 or longer years, there has been a push by the industry to go to other sheens, which include matte or flat, satin, and semi-gloss. And I want to talk about those types of finishes very briefly, and we'll do that by going into the spray booth in just a sec. But I want to show you some models which have those types of finishes on it. One way that you can do a satin finish on a guitar is simply to just spray a satin lacquer, which is what I did on my shop guitar, which is this Oak 000 right here. Now, this is my shop guitar. It really has seen a lot of playing, and satin finishes, if there's something to be said for them, they hold up really well to a lot of using the guitar basically and playing the heck out of it. Gloss finishes tend to get scratched easily and things like that, and a satin finish just doesn't show that. But I don't want to really go into how to spray a satin finish or a lacquer that's labeled satin, because that requires a lot of skill, the right material, and you also need a really, really good spray booth to do that. But what I do want to talk about in this video is some alternative finishes which you are able to produce during the wet sanding and buffing process, and they're on these two guitars here. The first finish that I want to talk about is what I'll call the Loudoun Finish, because I first heard about this finish on Loudoun guitars. Now, I have to confess, I have never seen or held a Loudoun guitar, but based upon his description, I thought I'd give it a shot, and that's what I did on this guitar here, which is an SJ model. And you do this type of satin finish by wet sanding and no buffing. So in other words, you're just wet sanding with certain grits up until you get this satin type of finish. And we're going to show you that, or at least how to do that, on the body of the prop guitar for this video before we take it to the buffer. But one thing about this finish is just the way it feels. This has a silky, just absolutely phenomenal feel to it that players, I'm sure, really appreciate. The sheen may be a little bit dull for some, but boy, once they pick it up and play it, this is a really nice guitar to play. As I said, satin sheens are not everybody's cup of tea, and some people that are paying big bucks for a guitar, they really demand gloss. And the thing is about gloss finishes is that they really show off the beauty of figured woods, such as this Cocobolo. A satin finish just will not show that kind of depth and figure. But what I like to do on my guitars is I do a semi-gloss buffed finish on the neck. And it's kind of a unique finish in that by doing it with the buffer and using a specific type of compound, I get a really silky feel to the neck that you would get when you rub to a satin sheen. And it's a little bit higher sheen. It's more in between a satin and a gloss, what we call a semi-gloss. It looks and feels fantastic. Finally, the last thing that I like to do on my guitar peg head overlays is I like to do what I call a rubbed satin finish. Now, I first learned how to do a rubbed satin finish in the furniture industry, or at least when I was doing a lot of furniture, and it's done using steel wool, or 4/0 steel wool, and a little bit of oil. And it's the finish that you'll find on an American-made Steinway black piano. And if you've ever seen a Steinway piano, it, in the right light, looks just like brushed metal. It's absolutely stunning. But the reason I like to do that on the peg head is that it disguises all the scratches that will ultimately or invariably come up when strings are changed and things like that. This gets a lot of wear and poking around with string ends, and a gloss finish will start to scratch easily. So on all my guitars, I do a hand rub satin finish on the peg head, and we'll show you how to do that. But before we do that, I want to go back into the spray booth to the blackboard and explain a little bit about the physics and optics of how you produce a satin, semi-gloss, and a flat sheen on a guitar. So this will be the last time at the blackboard in the spray booth for this video. Sorry about the overhead noise, but I have to run my fan because I'll be spraying a little bit of finish, and it's a really windy day outside, and if I didn't run the fan, the damper on the exhaust would make a lot of racket. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to diagram out how we produce things like satin, semi-gloss, and flat or matte finishes. And you can do it one of two ways. As we talked about earlier, in a gloss finish, you have your light source. Sorry, I had to do it. You know, I do create a lot of colors for the industry. But this is your source. Over here, we have the eye, or the human eye, and this is your surface. We talked about with a gloss finish that if this angle and this angle are equal, you get a gloss finish. And you get a gloss finish by taking that surface, removing all the orange peel and other surface texture, then wet sanding it after leveling it, and then buffing it up to gloss. However, to create satin finishes, as I said, you can do it one of two ways. One way is to spray a satin finish, or a finish that's labeled satin, matte, or semi-gloss. And when you spray those finishes, they contain a very fine silica additive. And what that does is as the finish dries, those particles float up to the surface, and they really don't poke through the surface. What they do is they just kind of lodge at the surface, and as a result, you have a non-gloss surface, because what that does, those silica particles, is they start refracting or diffusing light away, so that you no longer have this equal angle of incidence. And when you don't have that, you'll have a satin finish, or semi-gloss, or matte. The other way to do a satin finish is to leave some sanding scratches from the wet sanding process in the finish. And when you do that, what you're doing is you're creating, and again, I'm making this much larger than it actually is, but these scratches, when they are in the surface of the finish, will do the same thing as the satin silica particles. Instead of directly reflecting light from the source to the eye, they scatter it or diffuse it. And that's the way that you create a satin or a non-gloss finish. You either do it with a finish, or you can do it during the rubbing and wet sanding process. We're going to also show you a way to do a semi-gloss finish on the buffer that's kind of unique. And we'll go over to the shop room and show you those techniques. The first thing I'm going to show you is how to do a rubbed satin finish a la kind of Loudoun style. The second technique I'm going to show you is the buffed semi-gloss technique on the neck. And then finally what we'll show you is a hand-rubbed satin finish on the peg head overlay that looks really, really, really classy.